Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bitz About Botz, where I interview experts in the industry of intelligent automation.
I think one of the key things for insurance, and given the generative AI space that we're all perhaps beginning to feel a lot more, is the use of data. Insurance companies are sitting on a tremendous amount of data with respect to the way things have been historically processed. But at the end of the day, there's really a couple of things in my mind that don't change. One of those is a focus on the customer. The second of those is the actual execution of whatever technology that you're looking to use.
Hello, everybody. Paula Carneiro Cox here for the first recording of Bitz About Botz for the 2024 year. I'm thrilled to be joined by an expert in not only automation, but insurance, who will be sharing how the industry landscape is going to change, what we predict for AI in the insurance segment, and a little bit of information about how to get started for those who are still thinking through what automation is going to look like in their organization. So I'll turn it over to you for an introduction. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we finally got together, and I'm so glad that you're the first one of the year. Hello.
Thank you, Paula, and good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to everybody who may join. My name is Eoin O'Reilly. I've been, as Paula alluded, in the insurance industry for quite some time, 25 plus years. I've had the experience and the honor of having a multitude of different efforts to work on over the course of that time. And I'm particularly interested today in sharing some of my transformation experiences in the automation and now, of course, the upcoming AI space.
Well, that's fantastic. And it's funny because every time I prepare for one of these, I always think through what has changed and what's different. And truly, for those of us who have been in this space for a while, as practitioners, it hasn't changed much. I think the evangelization and almost democratization of these concepts to the market is what's changed. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think we all experience the news on the latest topics that are out there, the latest items that are moving up what we might call the hype circle, if you wish. But at the end of the day, there's really a couple of things in my mind that don't change. One of those is a focus on the customer. The second of those is the actual execution of whatever technology and/or tool set you're looking to use, and a discipline around that execution. And then lastly, at the end of the day, many of us are working for commercial organizations that have shareholders and stakeholders. And so at the end of the day, we need to represent a benefit that's accruing to all of those stakeholders, the customers, the shareholders, and the internal employees and company itself.
And I think that 360-degree lens of the stakeholders is really what has made you so successful in what you've done, not only at Chubb, but your experience in general. So I'd love to walk everybody through a little bit, and we'll go ahead and go back to your origins, if you will, in automation, and go back a little bit to some of the considerations that you made. Because while the technology has changed, vendors have emerged out of nowhere. We have almost decision fatigue for newbies to the market. There are some considerations that haven't changed, and there's things that need to be thought about, both in a perspective of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and the way in which the organization is going to adopt and communicate the adoption of these technologies. So I'd love for you to spend a little bit of time telling us about the considerations you make when thinking through an organizational change and transformation, as you called it. And I think there's a buzzword around transformation, but I know that when you say it, you mean it. So tell us a little bit about how you approach transformation, what's changed, and what do you think everybody needs to think of when they're approaching those decisions?
Yeah, so one of the very first things that I've always looked to do at the beginning of a transformation. And you're right, my definition of a transformation is, I've used the analogy before of burning the boats, right? So you land on shore and you burn the boats and there's no going back. And that's how we've dealt with transformations in the past. And we've been very successful in getting the right leadership and sponsorship behind that mandate. And that's probably one of the first things that one should be pursuing, and that is sponsorship from the top, and or from the decision makers to proceed forward. But thereafter, then you really move into the nuts and bolts of what needs to occur. And what I found to be extremely beneficial at the very start is ensuring that everybody has a similar understanding of, be it the technology, the tools, or the ultimate objectives that you're looking to achieve. And that often means ensuring that you bring in a pretty broad group of people into the circle very early on. And I know for myself, having started in the RPA space way back in 2014 as one of the very first users of a technology called Blue Prism, we specifically went and got our legal team in the room, our compliance team in the room, our risk team. Before we did any use cases, we got all of those individuals into a room so they specifically understood what the technology was and, importantly, what it was not. And we got to that stage where we began to have less and less people talking past each other, but really making reference to a similar set of data points around what they were looking to achieve and what the technology was.
No, I think that's spot on for what it is that we are looking for. Because if the stakeholder alignment within the organization doesn't expect the same outcomes, then how can we say what the North Star is and claim success? There's just not alignment that happens after, in an afterthought kind of perspective. So you mentioned something that folks often don't clue in on, and it's telling the stakeholders what not to expect from a technology. I think it's really easy for us to be, hypers and cheerleaders trying to evangelize or push an agenda of having automation in house. But if we overpromise and underdeliver, are we really doing the organization justice? So can you give a little example of maybe how you had to communicate effectively the power of the technology while curbing expectations and maintaining the integrity of what truly could be expected from the outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important point, setting the right expectation up front. Too often we see technologies that come into an organization and they never really hit the scale that's expected. And thankfully, over the course of my career, I've been successful in a few places where we have been able to garner enough scale to really show the true power of a technology or solution. And it comes in part, as you just said, at the very start, just really setting that expectation. And that comes in part through appreciating and or demonstrating directly to individuals what the technology can do. It also goes back to a point I made earlier around ensuring that people don't speak past each other when they're talking about the particular technology or solution. And that's where the education comes in as well. Now, in the past, what I've also found is there is many challenges put upon business leaders, and they'll look to anybody that can help change that and address that. But it's important to note that it's very rarely you will be able to get a solution that solves your issue end to end. You're going to have to combine it or couple it with others, and or for a period of time just be able to solve a part of the problem. And one way that we've been able to perhaps convince business leaders that, look, we can't do it all for you, we can do 50% or 70% of it, is to take some of the capacity saved and or the savings that have occurred and actually reinvest it back into that business. We've called it a leave behind in the past. And the purpose for that is to actually give the business some benefit while at the same time giving them some resourcing to continue to develop, to continue to look at how they can solve the entire problem, as opposed to getting that right off the bat, which is very rarely accomplished.
No, I completely agree. And several of our clients, especially when they're approaching scale, because I think it's very easy to find, the low-hanging fruit, finance and accounting, repetitive tasks. And most programs are at a maturity point where they're deciding whether or not to continue to double down on the investment or to stop. Maybe it wasn't, as fruitful, or there's even a lot of rip and replacing happening in the market right now. Folks thinking maybe it was the technology they chose incorrectly or something like that. Those of us who have been around the space know that rarely is a rip and replace on technology investment a good idea when you can salvage some pieces. And like you said, understand that you didn't solve from end to end with no human intervention. That's not the aim here. It's to find efficiencies and to solve parts of the problem where possible. And where there's throughput, absolutely take advantage of it. What I'd love for you to touch on, because we're seeing a lot of divide, a lot of our clients trying to figure out what kind of commercial models to come up with internally, because the onus winds up being on the intelligent automation group, the COE, Center of Excellence, if you will, which is usually born from a business unit to begin with. And then suddenly, that reinvestment that you just mentioned, who really reaps that benefit, right? Is the benefactor of the automation getting the savings in their P&L? Because if not, are we really servicing, our partners? So a lot of our clients, are really rethinking who pays for what and how chargeback models internally begin to work. So can you share with us a little bit about some of the approaches that you've taken over the years on funding, financing, and most importantly, delivering the value back to the benefactors of the automations that you've built?
Yeah. So I think there's quite a few things in there, but perhaps I'll start with what I found personally to be very valuable in all of that is a high degree of transparency. And so, to address some of the specific sub questions that were in there, it's not uncommon to have a new technology, be it RPA or document ingestion or something of that nature, to start in a central group. And that makes, in my opinion, a lot of sense. You want to initially garner a set of knowledge and then, share it out throughout the organization. Additionally, too, you want to have a certain amount of control over that initial investment so that you truly can appreciate, back to my transparency point, what you're spending and ultimately what you're not. Because it can go both ways. People can suggest what the investment has been, and or they can over suggest what it has been based upon their own individual agendas. You keep that centrally, it becomes a little easier to control. But as you begin to potentially increase the use of the technology, and I'll give the example of RPA, what we ultimately went and did with one of my previous employers was to actually create a total cost of ownership. And to make that very relatable to the business, we basically said, look, that's the equivalent of the salary of the robot that you now have. And so it became a very easy way for a business to quickly comprehend, well, hang on a sec, I've got a robot here, its total cost of ownership, including its own real estate, right? Its little office space, which would be a little VDI, and its own, salary, which would be the software license, and its own ongoing costs, which would be the cloud computing, whatever you had. Its cost is, let's say, $8,000. Well, now you're comparing that total cost of ownership, the full comp of a robot versus a human that might be making $40,000. And now you've got a business case that's already beginning to develop, at least an early indication that, look, we should investigate further. What we also did, though, as a central group in one of the group organizations I worked with, we put a little bit of extra into that cost of a robot. And we did that to kind of self-fund our own innovation and continuation of developing these bots. I've often said before that, look, the initial bot that you would get is an entry-level bot. But if you allow us to continue to upskill those bots, then I can give it eyes. I can give it the ability to look at a particular document and potentially extract data off it. If you want to take it a step further, I can give it ears to listen in on a customer service call, perhaps in a contact center, and be able to appreciate perhaps some of the nuances, the feelings, the emotion that's coming out, and guide a contact person. So we almost got to a point, we did get to a point where we were beginning to introduce, hey, you can have an entry level bot for this price, or I can give you a slightly more intelligent bot that can read at this particular price point, and so on and so on. And in each case, there was a different price point for the particular bot, but at the same time, an easily comparable number to what perhaps the business was spending internally themselves to accomplish those tasks.
Well, and that becomes relatable because it's a common currency within the organization.
Yes.
And I've often referred to, this idea of a digital workforce or a robot army, whatever you want to call it, as a mini version of BPO because you're essentially outsourcing to your robot workforce. And if you think about it the same way, the labor arbitrage is an easy way to understand how it is that you're offsetting some of those pieces. Now, in your analogy, I love that. And we actually have a slide that talks about the ears and the eyes to kind of do that relatability. The new, right, is understanding that these robots have a bit of a brain, right? And that's where the AI comes into place. And it's that predictive or prescriptive churn that the robot is able to contribute to whatever decision because of experience or because of human intervention or because of us feeding data and patterns that it can then relate to. And, for those folks who are just now tapping into understanding what the power of AI is, it truly is as though you're computing the knowledge of a human, but at warp speed. A robot doesn't need to check its math. It doesn't need to check and see if that additional file, was entered correctly. It's going to enter, it's going to do, it's going to resolve everything that has been programmed to do, coded to do correctly, perfectly, accurately, every time. The only human error, ironically enough, in our robot workforces is when the human interjects incorrectly. So the irony of that is that, the relatability of kind of doing that one for one, I think that's great. And then what we're seeing too is that chargeback model, if you're thinking about it as, a college graduate or maybe a graduate school or a law firm equivalent robot, right, of the continuing education, that also makes it a little bit easier to think through what percentage of resource planning you should do. Because as I've always said, we work a lot with CFOs. The biggest line item in any organization is human capital. And if you're looking at human capital as sort of your barometer for where you're going to achieve cost savings and or forecast for resource planning, you're really in a winning seat to truly understand the impact of that total cost of ownership. So I love what you just said about that. That's so brilliant. And I think it's such practical advice for budding COE leaders that kind of want to be maybe chief intelligent automation officer one day, right? To think that through from the lens of something relatable. I think it's really important in our industry to be able to storytell because these concepts are a little foreign for those that aren't, in it and completely ingested. And our business partners have to understand this on a level that they can. So I think that's so brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Eoin. And the other thing I wanted to, oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. Like
Yeah.
you make great reference to the fact that the quality and the output of many of these solutions is I won't say unquestionable, but it's there to see. However, I was just recalling an experience I had when we first deployed one of our first digital robots in a particular area. And as with any new technology and or new item within an environment, it usually becomes the immediate designee for anything that goes wrong. And so we've had multiple scenarios in the past where we've introduced a new technology, a robot to execute a process. And to your point, while you look at the results of the robot, everything is perfect. But if something goes down, it's going to be, well, that's where we'll likely look first. And so the moral here, or at least the learning that we took from that is be prepared not necessarily to be defensive, but be prepared to accept what's being presented and help identify the root cause, because in some way it's likely related to your solution. And the example I was just thinking of was we actually got to a scenario where our robots were so efficient that they were processing at a multitude of what would normally be processed, and their underlying legacy systems were beginning to slow down. And we still had human users on those systems, and they were complaining the system is getting very slow or it's locking up. And it wasn't through fault of the bots that we had put in play. It was actually what we should have done was a degree of performance testing to find when would we hit the limit of that legacy system. So it's a little long-winded story there, but it does highlight while the technologies themselves may do everything better, you're still going to run into issues that, technically speaking, could be root caused in the solution you've deployed, but are merely highlighting stresses or ceilings you've never hit up against before that now need to be addressed.
No, I think that's brilliantly said. And testing and the performance testing I think is so important, as is regression testing and the user experience, right? Having them understand what it is that they're going to expect.
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, if what we're trying to do is augment the workforce, because that at the end of the day is what we're trying to do, right? Then the workforce should be aligned to what the outcomes of these little performers are going to do. Other interesting story that just came to mind too is how many times in the early days, and there are folks that are just now dabbling into RPA or some of these intelligent automation tools. The concept of automating how the human does it isn't usually the right answer either, right? And so if you try to automate the today's way of doing a process, you're sure to find a snag because of those velocities that you can't anticipate, and the performance being at such warp speed by a robot. It does have, trickle down effects on the end results and the processes that follow. So I think those are really important things to keep in mind. But again, all human related. So it's about the testing, it's about getting the right partners, it's about socializing some of these concepts, because there's a lot of people like you who have been there, done that, and you provide a great resource pool for those that are just kind of charting out on some of these uncharted waters for them. So lastly, Owen, I wanted to tap your experience in insurance. So as a consumer, if I wasn't even in intelligent automation, insurance is a bear for payers, providers, requesters, getting things to reconcile. I keep saying that there needs to be a universal portal where everything that I've ever touched in my life, goes in. Other countries do it well, but we won't get into that. And honestly, the way that it works from a global perspective, insurance is so different, but it is still a sticky subject. And there's a reason why there's insurance practices for intelligent automation at various organizations like Wonderbots, like some of the partners that you mentioned, Blue Prism and UiPath. And there's insurance practices because it's a complicated feat. And yet there's so many simple ways, rule-based ways to go about getting things done. So I'd love to hear your predictions from 25 plus years in the insurance experience of what we can foresee with automation and AI in the insurance space in 2024.
Yeah, so that's a very broad question, and we all know how predictions normally end up. But I'll put my 2 cents out there for others then to opine upon, perhaps. I think one of the key things for insurance, and given the generative AI space that we're all perhaps beginning to feel a lot more, is the use of data. Insurance companies are sitting on a tremendous amount of data with respect to the way things have been historically processed, which are indicative of the ways and the outcomes that perhaps can be expected in the future. That data is there to ultimately train models, and those models ultimately become the experiences, perhaps, of the solutions that you'll deploy in the future. And so a focus on the data, on the focus on governing that data, and a focus on ensuring that it's applied appropriately I think is going to be key within the insurance industry. I expect insurance carriers are likely looking at having their own internal chat GPT type solutions that would be trained on their experiences, on what they're willing to accept as appropriate appetite for risk, and then ensuring that whatever is developed off it is representative of that from a company's historical perspective. The other part of it too, and we alluded to a little bit before, is there can be a very high price point for entry into some of these technologies, which may not always be easy to consume, especially for mid or smaller size insurance carriers. And so I can see potentially the development of generic insurance solutions or bots being put out there, a little bit like the BPO example that you just said, and they're brought in, and then ultimately they're enhanced with the internal learnings of the organization through that data approach I just made reference, so that they become a little bit more akin to the way that that particular organization works. Because I do believe the ability to do something in a robotic process automation way, the ability to intake a document, read handwritten data, unstructured data, that's slow, well, not slowly, as quickly going to become commoditized. I say slowly only because I was using those technologies back in 2015, 16, but where they were then and where they are now from an accuracy level is just night and day. But I do see that becoming commoditized. And it's really going to be an internal organization's data that will distinguish them from the peers. I also think their ability to execute. At the end of the day, and you've made reference to it a few times, it's the human element of this that really is a significant contributor to your success in this space, and I won't say failures, but the multiple learnings that you will have.
I think that's so brilliantly put. And I think the one thing that I'll contribute to your predictions is that I believe that there is even an opportunity for a new revenue stream given the data and being able to monetize that in a way that's going to be actionable ultimately for the customer, for the organization, and for all the peers. So we're really seeing a lot with that of monetizing the data that you have for the betterment of your client, for the understanding of your client. And with AI models becoming so savvy, we have the perfect playing ground internally with each of these organizations to be just that, the niche insurance partner, right, of tomorrow. So looking forward to that and hopefully reconciling some of the headache that I've had over the past few years. Well, Eoin, it has been very delightful speaking to you. I am so thrilled to have had the opportunity to get this information for everybody who is either considering a scale or starting a story of automation themselves. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Eoin, thanks again for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Paula.